Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Sick Talks. I have screwed up the number of the episode in the last two episodes, so I'm not even going to say which episode this is. I don't even know. But I do know that I'm joined by Caitlin Thompson. Caitlin is founder of Racquet Magazine and somebody who I have followed at a distance since I heard her appearance, I think, on How Long Gone, probably in the early days of the pandemic. I am not a tennis player or a racket sports enthusiast, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I do find what she does at Racket and what the team does really interesting, and I think it's also sort of emblematic of where independent media is at generally. So I wanted to just have her on to talk. Hi, Caitlin. How are you?
Ben, thanks for having me.
Hi. Where do I find you today, incidentally, just so we get the pleasantries out of the way?
I'm on the Lower East Side of New York.
I got it.
Where I've been for the last more or less 17 years or so. I married a local, so I'm never leaving.
Okay, got it. It's one of the you sort of got grandfathered into the rent controlled situation, or the cheap building.
I wish that were the case, but no, we live in Seward Park, which is not terribly luxurious or expensive. But also, my wife is an urban planner who works for the city, and so she takes a boat to work every day to go to Governor's Island. So we're down kind of close to where the boat terminal is, not unrelated for that reason.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, we are in a similar situation in Greenpoint where my wife and I have been here for 25 years within a 2 blocks radius of where we now live. And it's one of those things where it's like it's not as ideal a deal as you would imagine it to be, but it's also nothing to complain about. So
there's no place I'd rather be. If I can't be in my hometown of Montreal, and there is zero chance that I can convince her to go there with me, and it's even colder there than it is today here in New York. There's no place I'd rather be than New York.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. As a somebody who grew up in Syracuse, I appreciate the cold and I like the winter weather. But yeah, Montreal goes a step beyond.
Totally.
Well, cool. So I guess the point of these conversations is to act as a corresponding addition to the list of links that I publish every Thursday in SIC Weekly. And so I sent you an advanced copy, like a work in progress version of it, to just kind of see what jumped out at you. And I'll start by saying, I think as an entrepreneur yourself, and then also as somebody in media, because media can contain so many aspects of other types of business or other types of developments, I would imagine you could probably look pretty broadly at it and go, oh, this thing from fashion is directly applicable, or this thing from food is directly applicable. So I'm really keen to just see what jumped at you. What was something, for instance, that grabbed you?
I loved the piece of music criticism that managed to probably enrage Taylor Swift fans and made a reference to Sublime being canon, and just the idea that there are some sort of seemingly unapproachable topics now in the media landscape where you really have to be thoughtful about how you engage with fan communities. I think one of the things that's super interesting about media, and we're certainly at Racket cognizant of engaging with an affinity group, engaging with community. It's something we've done very, very well from the beginning. And, obviously we intend to do forever. But, there's a downside to engaging with fans, and whether they're fans of you or your publication or people in your ecosystem, there is a lot of sort of sycophant-esque expectations. And sure. So, I'm thinking specifically of, we early days published a really funny and fun piece about Alex Zverev in our pages. And then a couple years later, he found himself in the heart of a controversy about domestic violence. And those fans of his and fans of us change very quickly. And and it's sort of hard to know where to navigate your, sort of maintain your voice, but also be cognizant of interacting with fanships and fan bases. And so it's something I think a lot about, especially because we're in a sport that is predicated on fanship of certain players, of the sport itself, of good writers of some, voices, but also things change and they should change. And, where do you keep your North Star? And I think those are the kinds of questions you have to kind of constantly ask yourself. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself in an outdated model very quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting to try to reconcile the idea of journalistic media as a voice or a place or having a responsibility to some sort of objectivity. Because the piece that you're referencing, which is Bob Lefsetz's talking about some things being inviolate, and it's a classic Lefsetz rant that starts with the music business and then goes to politics and then comes back to the music business and then goes to fandom and then goes to like what a pain in the ass it is to drive on the 405 or whatever it is, like the classic Lefsetz crank vibes. But the thing that it is interesting about being media is that in that case, like what he's complaining about is the fact that you can't criticize certain things because the super fans of those things will reject your criticism and will come after you in a way that is nasty and emotional. By the same token, one of media's roles is to critique, and so you can't if you don't critique, you're no longer doing your job, and you're also no longer being interesting in any way. So it's.
Thank you for summarizing it in a much better way than I did, but
I don't think that's true.
It struck me, prior to founding Racquet, my career was for a decade and a half as a political journalist. I spent time at the Washington Post. I spent time at Time Magazine. I was at WNYC for a minute. Way back when I first got my start, I was at Paper Magazine. So I've had a couple of different perspectives on, fame, notoriety, publicity, how you cover public figures, obviously tennis players versus sort of pop stars at Paper versus political figures in the middle chunk there. But in that time, the media's role has changed drastically because we were gatekeeping. And there are many, many downsides to being gatekeepers, both on behalf of the audience, because the people holding the gates closed tend to look the same kind of way throughout history with the same kind of demographics and, all the sort of problems that entails. But there is some sort of expertise also that comes with the idea that some, media heft is earned and criticism is coming from a place of context and to some degree, not everybody can be an expert. And so, I do think we need to establish or reestablish or have a really interesting sort of dialogue about what media is for in an age where notable figures don't need the media. They've created their own media companies. And we've seen this, whether it's, Carmelo Anthony or LeBron James making their own media company, if it's Dua Lipa, who has a newsletter and a book club and, they don't need us. So what are we doing and how are we doing it? And to whom do we owe the truth and context. And I think about that all the time when I think about what we are providing to our audience and how we're providing it, and really what the role of media can and should be in a shifting landscape where the business model is very, very hard to stay on top of.
I think, okay, so a couple things. One is I'm glad that you got the Service 95 email with Dua Lipa's book club this morning, same as I did. That was not in the list, but we both saw it this morning. So There you go. I don't even think I signed up. I'm just glad that I'm glad that such a thing exists. I'm also not interested in being a part of it. Got my own reading list. But in any case, the starting with the Lefsetz post is interesting because to me, like the thing that guy does is engender a feeling in the reader that is like visceral, and you feel his emotion and intention, and it is 100% not objective reporting. It is 100% not measured in any way whatsoever. It's not well edited. It's kind of all over the place, but there's such pull to it. And I just wonder, like, as a publisher, how do you balance the desire to have stuff that is a little like off-piste, if you will, and stuff that is like satisfies the prerequisites of capital J journalism in the sort of, tradition in which you were trained?
It's a great question. And I think, it's one that journalism really has been grappling with since like gonzo journalism in the 70s. Right. And I think, the thing that I think a lot about is, you know, the notion of ecstatic truth. Whether Werner Herzog coined it or not, he claims to have done, and who am I to quibble?
His memoir next on my reading list, funny enough. I haven't cracked it open yet.
Very good.
But I mean, I read the excerpt in the New Yorker about his time in Pittsburgh, and I was just like, I have to read this whole book. I'm
of course
dying. So anyway, please go ahead.
Werner Herzog also, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, there was a published collection of interviews that he was given called Herzog on Herzog. And so if you read that, as I have, as a Werner Herzog superfan, I'm really glad he's getting his due. And that's become more of a thing that I can discuss because my fanship felt very isolating prior to him being part of the zeitgeist.
So sorry, let's just digress for a second. When do you think Herzog hits the zeitgeist? Is it in sort of the Bear film? That to me was maybe the tipping point.
For me, that was, you know, I had heard of Fitzcarraldo and Aguirre, Wrath of God, and, you know, some of the earlier works of fiction. For me, Grizzly Man in the early 2000s was really when I got to understand what he was doing. I was also dating a documentary filmmaker at the time, and it was useful to understand because I had just graduated from journalism school. I went to the University of Missouri on a tennis scholarship to study magazine journalism, as it were. And I was dating somebody who was in the photo video department, and understanding the sort of insanity of him being in his own documentary in the way that he became a character was so foreign to me because we were taught this whole concept of, you know, traditional Western journalism being super, super objective. And I don't even want to say Western journalism. U.S. journalism specifically, because British journalism is filled with sort of opinion, and certainly political journalism is partisan in the UK.
Yeah, for sure.
In a way that I actually kind of think is maybe better. And so you at least know where this... 100%
agree with that.
I think the idea of objectivity is performed anyway. I think it's a performative notion that doesn't actually get to the heart of...
100%.
And I think the more we are honest with ourselves about the lens of the journalist, yes, obviously we require ourselves to be not willfully misleading with facts, not fictitiously fabricating quotes or concepts. But I think just by virtue of who you are and the assigning editor who decided that this story merited a follow-up, because a lot of them die on the, you know, in the pitch process, there are already subjective choices that have shaped the notion of the story way before it even gets to you, reader, consumer, listener,
of course,
etc. And just not owning that and being honest about that, I think, is one of the things that has made this very sort of stupid argument about objectivity take center stage, when in fact it should be about ecstatic truth, which is Werner Herzog's concept that by what you describe with sometimes a diatribe
with Bob Lefsetz,
Lefsetz is sort of getting at something truth deeper than truth, which is it is a collection of anecdotes that is personal, but gets at a deep truth, which everyone feels to be true because it is true, which is there are very few ways in which we can safely critique and have a dialogue, whether it's about a Taylor Swift album or about politics, without engaging in mindless partisan rhetoric. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a huge...
I agree.
There's a huge gulf in what should be a robust dialogue between reasonable people, where we should be seeking to understand each other. And that kind of is the point of media, to facilitate that. And now it's a tool that's sort of been taken away, or at least threatened.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, I mean, as a student then of these sorts of things, do you have a not necessarily a moment in time, but I'm really big. I love these sort of like moments of inception ideas, right? Like the room where it happened kind of thing. And I wonder to what it sort of can trace to history the point that changed. Like I'll give you an example. A lot of the critique that comes out of higher education, or about higher education, and I think the whole sort of like progressive woke movement, all of this sort of stuff that has been so controversial, gets traced back to some of the teaching and the social policy at Antioch College in Ohio in roughly 1999 or the late 1990s. And the thing that I find interesting about that is twofold, right? One is Dave Chappelle, his father taught or teaches at Antioch, which is why he's in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And so there's this really fascinating juxtaposition in that town that you can imagine, but also just the notion that like the place that we have been, or the incapacitation of, moderated debate in 2024 started 25 years ago in a very particular place, and you can trace it back to that. That may not be correct, but I just wonder if there are any other sort of associations that you have where you're just like, oh yeah, the launch of Gawker, or when, I don't know what, the dot boom ended or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think another piece from your reading list that I've seen this sort of theory floated otherwise, but I think it was nicely summed up in, The Internet's About to Get Weird by Rolling Stone. That's in that reading list. And there's an Atlantic article as well that sort of speaks about like, plant-based losing its meaning. I think the internet essentially has become flattened, and I think part of it is what happens when you have a platform first. Platforms aren't publishers. They should be. They technically are, and they're funded at the expense of publishers.
Right. They have taken the publisher monetization model.
That's right.
Pretty directly.
But they've skirted, because we have, octogenarians in Congress on both sides of the aisle who have no idea how the internet works, or media really, who've sort of allowed it to happen because they don't know how to regulate it, because they don't know how it works. And if you look at, I think what's happened in media in Europe and how they've been way more protectionist of media against platforms, obviously Google and Apple, and to a degree Amazon, the amount of cookies that you have to accept into. I mean, we're having sort of I'm getting into sort of the technical weeds, but my point is just Europe as a consortium, as a governing structure, the EU has taken a much more, I think, proactive stance about what the internet can and can't do vis-a-vis media and vis-a-vis misinformation. And I think because of that, the internet and media has remained more valuable and viable, both as a business, but also as a convening place. And I'm equating the internet with media. Obviously, most media now takes place on the internet, but they're distinct. Obviously, not all internet is media. But I do think it's not so much Gawker, but actually Gawker is a great example, because it's when Gawker was killed, and when.
Interesting. Okay.
We as a society allowed a rich guy to kill it for no reason. I mean, obviously the courts decided that it was, on behalf of Hulk Hogan, a violation of privacy. But really, we had an opportunity opened when the First Amendment was used, was not essentially defended correctly. And then you have essentially internet billionaires being able to go after anybody and kill media sort of at will, because we don't have as robust a structure as we should. So there's a couple of things that I look at. Number one, and I've talked about this a lot more as a political reporter, which I used to be, than I do these days. But I think the beginning of the end was actually in the 80s with Michael Powell, Colin Powell's son, running the FCC and allowing essentially our political airwaves to become a free-for-all. So the equal time rule went out the window. Candidates were not needed to be afforded the same amount of coverage. And so if you look at politics and basically the media getting Donald Trump elected by not being able to wean themselves off of the, incredibly juicy ratings and advertising that goes with those.
The crack cocaine that is his unhinged mind. Yeah. The
80s FCC equal time rule does not get thrown out. This is a totally different ballgame, and all of a sudden our elections look a lot more like that they do in other sort of civilized parts of the world, which is to say that we have like an actual exchange of ideas and it becomes less about entertainment and more about information. So part of it is that rule, the rise of cable news, and just allowing our systems to get degraded to such a degree that it's sort of a free for all and people essentially can pay to have whatever information they want dominating, but also can kill stuff they don't like. Peter Thiel decided he hated Gawker because Gawker outed him. He was looking for a reason to kill it. He found one eventually because they, overreached. I would argue they didn't overreach, but that to me was actually the beginning of the era of the internet we're in now, which is it's all throttled essentially by 4 or 5 different, billionaire technologists.
So I have a couple of things that I want to pose to you. One is I can imagine it being having heard you say things like this. It must be suddenly very intimidating to pitch stories to Racket, to just be like, okay, how am I tying this to macro trends all the way back to Michael Powell's FCC? Shit, this is going to be tricky. But I commend you on that, because I just think like the ability to go galaxy brain and then get to the level of specialty that you need to in order to be niche based is not, I don't think a lot of people hold both of those things in their hands. And I like I like to think that I can manage that. And I love being able to, I love finding
based on the questions you're asking, you obviously can. And I think like there is something really profound about the idea of ecstatic truth. Like the kind of sports media I'm not interested in is recaps. Sometimes people are great at turning a phrase about something that explains what people have seen. That's great.
Yeah.
There's a room for a little bit of that flavor. If it gets to be too much, then you're not illuminating anything for anybody. And I think for me, what sports is so much of an unexplored territory, despite the fact that sports coverage is, wall to wall and it exists a lot of places, although not so much about tennis, is just the idea that sports is one of the last sort of truly unifying, but also kind of safe playgrounds for a lot of different ideas, concepts, collisions.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think because of that, it can contain a lot of things. So I don't find match recaps personally very interesting. I don't find profiles of players particularly very interesting. Some of them are really well done. And if there's an angle, I would point to Chloe Cooper-Jones writing in GQ about Juan Martín del Potro. And the premise of that was because Chloe Cooper-Jones was born with a physical limitation that means her life is lived in a state of constant pain. And Juan Martín del Potro's body has literally given up on him before his heart was willing to give up on tennis. All of a sudden you have an incredibly powerful, beautiful, and universal way to step into something that you don't need to know what he did on the court, and you don't need to know much about her writing and her amazing personal essays, although you can, to appreciate how this all of a sudden gives you a lens into a human being. And to me, those are the most interesting and most profound. And I think Racket was intended and built to be this bigger tent that can accommodate a lot of different stuff.
So interesting. Like you've cited that example as you're talking, and I'm thinking about the ecstatic truth of I love the fact that you're returning to that. It's not a part of my regular sort of vocabulary or acumen, but I'm something that I'm going to add. But as you talk and as you we sort of, I ruminated on that term. The writer that comes to mind for me is Plimpton, and who I was introduced to through The Curious Case of Sydd Finch. Do you know this story?
No, tell me.
Okay. Amazing. But partially because it gets to some of the other themes that we've touched on. So The Curious Case of Sydd Finch, the Mets, spring of, I want to say 86, there is a story that comes out in Sports Illustrated, and it's about the fact that the Mets have this prospect in spring training who is beyond a phenom. And they've put up this special tent in the spring training grounds that nobody can see into. And apparently they've got this guy who can throw a ball harder than anybody else has ever thrown it. Right. In fact, he can throw the ball at 169 miles an hour.
It's absurd.
Right. but there's this whole big story. And his name is Siddhartha Finch. He was raised in the, let's call it Kathmandu Valley, by parents who were diplomats or something like that. He learns to throw a baseball by virtue of throwing rocks at snow leopards.
What?
He has this curious sort of morphology. Like, imagine Joey Ramone as a pitcher, right? That kind of like gangliness. But because of this unique morphology, he can, he's got leverage on these pitches. And then he likes baseball because, coming from the Kathmandu Valley, he's a student of Zen, and he likes the idea that the baseball game is like theoretically endless, right? Like innings are played until the tie is broken, right?
Tennis is the same. Yeah.
And so this is, and he gets in. Now it turns out that this thing came out on April 1st. And in if I remember correctly, in the left-hand column of the first page, the typography spells Happy April Fool's Day or something like that, right?
Okay.
But it blew it, in an era pre-internet, pre-fact check, whatever it was, people were just like, what the fuck? And so Plimpton ends up writing a book about about Sid Finch and his life and his whole fictionalization of this story, which is fantastic, and which I read as a 11-year-old or something like that. To me, not just the fabrication of it, but just that whole notion of like the impossible synthesized in a person, a vessel, a story.
That's right.
Gets to the idea of that ecstatic truth thing really directly. And I wondered what else, other than the story you mentioned, like what else you looked at prior to Racket and went, I got to do that. That like, this is what we're here for.
That's such a staggeringly big question. Because I think for me, being a reader my whole life, and also, reading a lot of, nonfiction across the board, a ton of fiction. I think anything that illuminates the human experience is interesting to me. And I think that's true whether it's, Matt Taibbi essentially like predicting the Trump presidency and successful election in Rolling Stone in like 2015 from the campaign trail. Obviously everybody cites David Foster Wallace for a lot of reasons, or whether it's, Ursula Le Guin writing about, Earthsea and mages and magic, but also really getting to something profoundly human, which is how do we deal with power? How do we, treat the least among us? How are we, how do we progress in our souls through trials and tribulations? Like, there's so many reference points for me that go so far beyond sports writing, or so far beyond even nonfiction to cite. But I think as a student of the medium myself, and I don't write very much, but I and have enjoyed it in the last couple of years when I've had the opportunity to do so. One of the things that I really look for and I think is really, really important. And, even from the first issue, when I was kind of like, okay, I love Taffy Brodesser-Akner's writing so much. There's so much life in it. There's so much humanity in it. And I didn't know her, but I knew she was a fan of tennis based on some of the conversations I'd had. So I just reached out and I said, hey, would you ever write about tennis? And it took some convincing, and I, needed to get her comfortable with the idea that we didn't need her to be an expert. We just needed her to be an expert on her own human experience and any tennis knowledge we could give. Those are really, to me, the best things that we've published, because, and the writing that I admire the most, whether it's in our pages or, obviously she went on to create an incredible fiction piece with Fleischman Is in Trouble that, just got nominated for a bunch of Emmys when she was allowed to adapt it, and she was encouraged to adapt it and turned into the showrunner for the adaptation on TV. I think if you're somebody who can see humanity and see truth in something, then it finds its way into the work, fictitious or otherwise.
Sure.
Okay.
So I am interested to know then, because you clearly, in grasping, let's call it both sides of the coin, are thinking a lot about what Racket does and it's the effect that it has on intended audiences. You're also familiar on the business side with the idea that you have to grow the culture to grow the market, and that, to a certain degree, evangelizing is a part of what makes the business grow. How do you balance wanting to sort of like paint a picture and transmit the sort of that human observational quality versus the notion of like, hey, we've got to make this a thing that people want to do? Or are they essentially the same thing as you imagine them?
It's a good question. I mean, you're catching me at a really interesting time in Racket's history. My co-founder and I parted ways in the fall, essentially kind of because of this. And, I wish him no ill will. He was somebody who I think kind of wanted to keep it simple and just make, a sort of more straightforward offering rather than have like a larger ecosystem of events and merch and kind of this affinity affiliation, which, great. Like that's no hard feelings. But I think when I look at what motivated me to start Racket and why I was so passionate about bringing together incredible writing and photography and design. And, there's so many people we've been lucky enough to work with. And I don't want to by any way downplay any one contributor's importance, but, there are so many incredible storytellers. There are so many incredible voices that the supply of that is really endless. What I think is really more difficult and something that I've thought a lot about and, had to think really hard about in the last year or so, which is how do we make that a sustainable business that can grow not only our own endeavor, but also the sport? Because for me, one of my motivations was having grown up, not with a lot of money, needing a scholarship to pay for college, getting a tennis scholarship to go to journalism school, but also feeling very alone in the world of competitive tennis and disconnected from the initial joy that I had learning on a...
Why?
I started playing tennis because my grandmother had taught me. She had taught herself as a retiree. She was a nurse and picked it up because she moved to someplace with warm weather. She didn't belong to a country club. She played on public high school tennis courts, loved it, and brought me into that because she was going to do it anyway. And I would spend summers with her while my parents were working. And that was a joyous moment of connection, free play, experimentation that the better I got at the sport and the more serious the sport got for me, meaning tournaments and competitions and rankings and, ultimately vying for a college scholarship. Had I been better, it would have been vying for, a spot on the Challenger Tour or better. But it didn't. My talent was fully maximized by getting a free education. It got lonelier and it started to feel like a zero-sum game. And it started to feel like this sport that was actually just a game was something that was filled with sort of malice and cheating and parents that were overcooked. Interesting. It sucked a lot of the joy out of it for me in a way that I felt like, I kind of wanted this return to this utopian idea that by playing together, we can connect and we can get to some deeper truth about ourselves as human beings. And I think that's a really highfalutin esoteric answer. But as I thought about, my business partner and I were splitting ways and before I decided what I was going to do, I had to really look at myself and say, hey, listen, do I feel like I've done what I needed to do with Racket? Did I feel like in setting out to make this thing that could be obviously publishing great pieces and, finding great artists and that sort of thing, did I feel like we accomplished this bigger idea of showing that play and connection actually can make people feel like they're part of something and make people feel like not only can they be passive as a recipient, but also an active participant in coming to our events and meeting each other and finding a new way of being, of identifying. And I felt like truly we had just kind of started to do those things. And those are the things that make all the money. So, so it became like less of a choice and more of an obligation. And I felt like I couldn't walk away until I had really demonstrated the power of those things together.
Okay, so first of all, I wanted to say shout out to Heidi Hartwig, who introduced us, who has done some events with you, and who's
amazing
dear
woman.
longtime friend of mine, friend of the newsletters. But as you go through that, particularly the idea of your grandmother's late start in tennis. I have a bunch of mobility issues, which people who are tuned in regularly will know. I had my hip replaced, and I'm just like have some arthritis and stuff. Nothing that is dramatic in any way or limits me, except that I am no longer as active as I used to be. In all of that, as you're talking, it sort of makes me think, well, there is also the not tennis stuff. There is padel, there is pickleball. But from everything I've ever heard, you seem quite devoted to tennis particularly, and maybe have some sort of, let's say pointed opinions about pickleball in particular. And I'm interested to know where you sort of draw the line, or how you distinguish between those. And I'll say this: I am sympathetic to the drawing of those lines, because as somebody who grew up as a skateboarder, I cannot step foot on scooters. Talk about Bob Lefsett's Inviolate. It's inviolate. No, it's not happening ever. Under any circumstances.
I
not for any good reason, but
no,
just cause.
We all have our lines in the sand. I think I've softened a little bit, only because the call was coming from inside the house. My mother-in-law was surreptitiously playing pickleball and didn't tell me about it. And she was like, I have a doctor's appointment. And I'd be like, are you okay? You've been going to the doctor a lot. And it turned out she was in like a clandestine pickleball league. And I was kind of like, what? I need to kind of get off my high horse about this and just decide that anything that joins people together and gets them engaged is probably not a bad thing. My two areas that I have a harder time with, and it truly comes out of a love for just the sport, but also I love padel. I think it's an incredible complement to tennis. I think it is not cannibalizing tennis. I think if I felt like there was enough tennis courts, I would be less annoyed with people taking courts over. But I think that's starting to get addressed, because I think that is such a widespread enough issue that I think now people are sort of realizing, like, hey, people need lots of space to play. If you go to a European country, if you go to Canada, where I'm from, the idea of public parks, public facilities, public is sort of a God-given right. And I think because of that is now getting addressed. And the other thing that was making me really frustrated was just the incredible move of venture capital to come into the sports space and find something a little quick and easy in the form of pickleball it should have probably gone to padel, because I think padel actually has a lot more white space in terms of growth. But also tennis has made it so hard to be an outsider in any regard, an outsider media owner, an outsider investor, an outsider who hasn't grown up with the game. Everything about the sport has sort of been signaling really for the last 30 years or so that newcomers are not welcome, whether that's new money, new audiences, new players. And I like to think that one of the, and that's kind of what I was alluding to when I said the mission of Racket. Truly the mission of Racket to me is obviously publish great writing, obviously have great photographers and great designers and, beautiful things and fun parties and cool merch. That's awesome. But that's also, a lot of people can do that. And I think we kind of started to stagnate and, kept throwing up the same photos on Instagram and kind of went to the well where we got a painter for the cover, and it's great and beautiful, but we did it. So what actually does it want to be? What can we do uniquely when 8 years ago we started, nobody was talking about tennis. Nobody thought it was cool. Nobody was posting nostalgia. So what can we do uniquely? We can now, because we have authority, convene. We can bring people together and have those people sort of be accountable and put them on a panel and say, hey, what are you doing about Saudi Arabia? What are you going to do about equal pay? What are you going to do about domestic violence? We have the power to do that, where somebody with an Instagram account who's posting beautiful imagery like we have been doing for the last 8 years, let them. That's great.
May not. Yeah, they may not.
They're increasing, visibility for the sport. So that means we can focus on something else. We can do something different. You know, in an age where anybody can spin up a Substack, anybody can have a podcast, you know, that's great. That's all additive. I mean, listen,
very seen.
We're both people who have podcasts. I worked in public radio, and the public radio folks were like, how dare they? The sound isn't that good. And it's like, no, guys, that's not the point. So what can radio do uniquely? What can something like Racket do uniquely? And I think this phase of our growth is not necessarily going after other racket sports. In fact, probably being a little friendlier, but also trying to get through convening, through community, and through using storytelling to make people feel connected. That is, I think, the power of creating that brand. And so because of that, that's a long way of saying I've gotten a little more chill about pickleball, but only because I see this all as a way for people to connect with each other. And there's a capital J journalism aspect to it, but there's also a really kind of more ultimately important and business model friendly way to think about it, which is capital C community. And you're, you know, whether it's you conducting breakfasts or having newsletters or doing podcasts, you're doing the same thing. And I think that matters. And that, if anything, I can sort of hopefully be, you know, kind of a mascot for that. But Racket is really built to have a lot of different voices. And if we had a great pickleball writer or pickleball voice, then I, unlike this time last year, now would be sort of open to it, as long as I felt like it got to something that was a greater truth or greater sort of welcome to the tent kind of viewpoint.
No, look, I appreciate all that. By the way, as I don't have a pickleball person for you, but Jeff Carvalho never ever shuts up about padel. So you know,
great.
He's your guy there.
Good.
One thing that I as you were talking about community, big C and small C community, one thing that occurs to me also, as well as getting into like thinking of a publication not as an item, but as an element of an ecosystem, not as a, you know, like a single purpose vehicle, but rather as something that powers a flywheel and is powered by other elements of a flywheel. I would imagine there are other, not necessarily like competitive, but comparable publishers or organizations or brands or whatever that you look at and go, oh, this is so cool what they're doing. So next week's guest is going to be Daisy A. Liotta from Dirt, who I really like for the same reason that I like Racket, but who also started out with a membership model based on crypto, which I wouldn't have advised them to do, and which they've made a pivot from. But by the same token, it was admirable that they started that way. I wonder, if we use that as a stalking horse for the conversation, who else do you look at and kind of go, I love what these guys are putting together because it's the kind of, you know, holistic approach I'd love to take, or that I'm building towards? Totally.
And the answer is really long. I mean, I think that's why I read Why Is This Interesting? And I think you probably do too, because you like learning about what. So I think the business model question is a really good one. You know, what inspired me to come up with the concept of a print magazine was reading about Monocle and reading about how a smaller audience, but one that had a high lifetime value, was really, really valuable and really sort of unique. That was at a time that nobody was doing print, and it, was something that I think Tyler Brûlé was able to create an entire ecosystem around. I think that has changed a little bit because the print subscription model is actually fundamentally sort of broken. We've struggled with it. And frankly, part of what the evolution of the company is we're not going to stop doing print. It's beautiful. It's important. It's a coffee table, but treating it a little bit more like a collectible as opposed to a timed publication is probably the smart way to pivot. I liked reading what Chris Black said in his newsletter for GQ about how print magazines are essentially merch, which is not to say that you don't imbue them with the highest quality storytelling, the highest quality journalism, of course.
Of course.
But I also think like that's not the hard part. The hard part is not the content. The hard part is creating the urgency, creating the business model around it that makes sense. And I think if you want to have like a Substack that's essentially subsistence farming, or an art project that's a print magazine, I think those are great things. There's lots of those. But I look at companies like what I see Flagrant Magazine trying to do with their Discord channel. This is an all women's.
Interesting. I don't know Flagrant.
Get to know Flagrant. It's a women-led basketball publication, and they'll dabble in print, but again, when it makes sense economically, and otherwise the community really propels it. I'm also looking at The Gist as a sort of women-centric sports media company that is doing really, really smart things with social and community. And I think if your business model isn't evolving, and if you're not taking big swings, then you're doing essentially a hobby. And I think that that's fine. Hobbies are great. I have plenty.
Yeah, of course.
I'm a hobbyist chef. I like going to restaurants and trying to replicate meals in my home, sometimes better outcomes than others. But I think for me, thinking about the future of the media, we really have to be thoughtful about where the business model evolves. And so looking at some of the folks on the cutting edge, I think there's a reason a lot of them do events. There's a reason a lot of them have larger confabs. And I think that for me is not to take anything, to keep everyone in your growing footprint. But really, the New York Times is not a media company anymore. It's a collection of games, recipes, news, entertainment, experiential. And I think that's really smart because they're still alive.
Oh, awesome. Well, listen, Caitlin, I really appreciate you spending the time here, making yourself available. I think Racket is fascinating. Everybody who is watching and reading the newsletter should be following it. So I'm going to make sure to make that easy. But in the meantime, let's stay in touch and keep chatting, because the philosophical side of this is, super rewarding as well.